While dealing with prorations on the settlement statement, another one that you may have to deal with is a rent proration. Now, keep in mind, a rent proration will only be relevant if the seller is selling a property that has a tenant in place. Now, if that is the case, we need to make this fair between the parties. Think about it for just a moment. When the tenant paid their last rent, they paid it to the seller because the seller owned the property at that point. But the seller didn't own the property the whole month. So think about in terms of rent, what would be fair? I think it would be fair if the buyer were to be reimbursed for the part of the month that the buyer is going to own the property. So let's take a look at what that would look like in a rent proration. Now, in a rent proration, what you want to remember is it's a calendar month proration. And in pre-licensed class, calendar months are, in fact, 30 days. So we could say it doesn't really matter what month we say it is. Let's say it's March, just to have a month. But the reason it doesn't matter what month is, since it's a calendar month proration, they're all going to be the same given a 30-day month. So in this particular case, the closing is happening on, let's say, 3/20. Okay. And the rent on the property is $900 per month. Now, as I said in a lot of prorations, I like to have a starting point. And the starting point for me is always to just simply say, well, how much is it per day? If it's $900 per month, how much is it per day? Well, if all months have 30 days, then we simply divide by 30. And you'll see in this case that the rent is $30 per day. Okay, now let's take a look at this. Typically speaking, the seller is going to own the day of closing. And in this case, it actually helps them because they get to keep the 20th. So you say, well, how many days should the buyer get paid for? Well, there are 30 days in the month. It's closing on the 20th. So therefore, the buyer is going to own it for 10 days. And at closing, the buyer should get that money. So $30 per day times 10 days. $30 times 10 days equals $300. $300. Okay. Now remember, at the closing, we don't exchange dollar bills. So what we need to do is we need to take this money and from one party and give it to the other party. So we're going to debit the seller and we're going to credit that 300 to the buyer. Now, keep in mind, this was only important if there is a tenant in place. This would not happen on all transactions, but only if selling a property that has a tenant in place. Now, I'd also like you to look back at that problem as well, because sometimes we don't necessarily ask you a math problem about a math concept. We could just simply ask you what we call a law question. So when you look at this problem right here, they may ask a question about what would the proration look like in regards to a tenancy, a rent, when the seller was paid on the first of the month. And what they're actually looking for in that question is, we're going to debit the seller and credit the buyer, and it's going to be the same amount. Did you notice that whatever we take from the seller is what we give to the buyer? And the reason they ask that question is it gets kind of confusing, because what happens is people get their mind all twisted in knots, and they'll say something like, well, we're going to take 300 from the buyer or 300 from the seller and give 600 to the buyer, or we're going to take 600 from the seller and give 300 to the buyer. That doesn't work. In a proration, whatever you're taking from one party is what you give to the other party. So I want you to know the math on this problem. Having said that, I also want you to understand this if it comes up as what we call a law question as opposed to a math question.